All right. As we have been doing, we will just kind of proceed through the debate until we find those paths that we need to follow around a little bit. Clarissa, I thought that you started off pretty well. I like the opening, for instance. I like the whole attitude that you have at the opening, talking about how Brown did this, but it's going to have these consequences. You give us a preview of what the supporting structure is going to be. The inherency argument doesn't need a lot of development because we know that the law has been passed. You kind of explained it at the beginning. So everything else is all significance argument. Here are the harms that are going to occur because of this particular policy. And they're outlined in a pretty straightforward way. The only thing that's a little bit odd is that in your preview, it's jobs, small businesses, and inflation. And in the structure of your speech, it's small businesses, jobs, and inflation. So it's a little bit out of sequence of what you said at the beginning. But the points were relatively clear. That wasn't a big deal. So you label all of the points pretty clearly, and there are transitions between those points that are really effective. This is not a debate where there was a shortage of information. Everybody had lots of data that they could apply, lots of quotes that they could use to support their position. So there's a lot of evidence that gets used in the speeches. I thought the first affirmative constructive was very well structured. You start with a good example about what's happened in Seattle. I think you need, and there was also later on in the debate an estimate about what the number of jobs would be, for instance, in that we could potentially lose. At one point you mentioned 160,000 or 150, 60,000 someplace. I forget exactly where that was. Oh yeah, there it is. It's on the second point. So you've got good data to start with, talking about why this is a significant problem, and it's localized primarily to California because this is where we're doing this sort of thing. And then you also present your technological argument there, which I think comes in handy to you later on in the debate because, as you've both pointed out, the negative never responds to this as a potential strategy. So in essence, maybe the businesses will continue to thrive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to continue to hire. And one of the things that you might point out, for instance, because they keep coming back to this argument later on in the debate that says, better wages result in better retention. You know what? A kiosk never quits its job. And so if you replace somebody with a kiosk, you don't ever have to worry about that again. And this whole argument that says there's going to be some economic benefit that comes from this assumes that people aren't going to be responding to this. And of course, they're going to respond immediately to this. Maybe 10 years from now, there'd be this long-term benefit because all the employees will have more money in their pockets to spend, and then that will result in some benefit. But if you're a small business owner and you're faced with this situation, here's what you paid this year in wages to your employees, $200,000, and here's what you have to pay next year in wages, $300,000. Well, that's a big chunk of change that you're going to have to make up someplace. Where are you going to make it up? You're going to either decrease your number of employees or you're going to increase your prices. And both of those things feed the arguments that you're making. Now, that's it. When you talk at a micro level, I think it's a little bit easier for you guys to kind of explain this argument. When you get at the macro level, that's when these other issues get introduced, and that's, I think, where most of the dispute seems to exist. So the first affirmative constructive I thought was pretty solid. It sets up everything. It's easy to follow. All right, Mirka, when you present your argument, you basically follow the structure of the affirmative by responding to particular points. Now, I do think that you have a tendency, as everybody in the debate does, to rely on your evidence to make the argument and not always explain what your argument is in response to the other side's claim, and then present the evidence to support that point. So there's frequently, I don't want to call it a data dump, but that's a little bit what we got sometimes is when here's a quote, here's an example, but what does all that mean and how does it apply to the argument that the other side made? We don't always get that. Sometimes you explain what the argument is, but I don't always know, well, what does that mean to what the other side is saying? So I know that there's an answer there, and you have answers on everything. I mean, they're very clear sets of evidence that you're applying to those particular points, but I don't know that they necessarily respond to the specifics of the affirmative. For example, later on in the debate, they come back to this real example of Seattle where we know we've lost 10,000 jobs. You've got this estimate here that says low wages are paid primarily, 66% of the low wage jobs are in big businesses, not small businesses. 3 out of 5 small businesses support an increase in the minimum wage. And then you've got a little bit of an economic argument that applies to this particular position. But none of that, of course, is specific to the examples that they're pointing out here. And they're suggesting that these are, complications in the businesses. Now, I don't know that they follow up on the small business argument as well as they could. But I think you've got some, kind of like first line arguments here that need to be applied a little bit more directly. Because at the end of the debate, it comes back and says, we've got this 3/5 of the people who have these jobs suggest that it's okay to increase this, or they're in favor of this, but that's a $12 an hour thing. By the way, that's, I think that's a legitimate criticism that comes up later in the debate. One of the things that does confuse me a little bit, though, is if everybody who's in favor of increasing the minimum wage, who's a business owner, you don't have to wait you don't have to wait for the minimum wage to go up. If you think people should be paid more, pay people more. Why is that not happening? If this is really these people's sincere belief, they should be paying more on their own businesses. That's just one of those kinds of arguments that seems to stick out immediately when they've used a piece of information like that. Okay, then you don't have to wait for the government to increase your wages. You can give anybody whatever wage you want to. If you think they deserve more and it's going to be a benefit to you in the long run, pay them more. I think that this is one of those places where there's a good question about how this information was derived at, what it is people are talking about, and that they're trying to get a lot of mileage off of it that I'm not sure that they ought to be getting. And that's, like I said, one of those places where there's not as much analysis going on as there is. Well, I've just got some evidence, and I'm going to read the evidence in response to that point. Both sides, I think, have done an excellent job finding evidence that applies to these issues. You just need to kind of fine-tune it a little bit and make claims with the evidence, and sometimes use the evidence to respond to particular points. I thought you did a good job challenging the unemployment argument. You've got the general quote that says that there's minimal risk. We've got a whole bunch of economists who say this sort of thing, and I think that should force them to have to make the argument a little bit more strongly about what the impact here is. I don't think that's a hard argument to make. I think there's a good response to this argument, but I'm not sure that they've made that argument. And later on, I think you can legitimately come back and say, well, wait a second. We showed from several studies that contemporary research finds that there's little impact on employment. They've got some study that says that it's going to have this kind of impact, but the consensus of opinion is that it's not, and we think that you ought to believe the 6 Nobel Prize winners and the 594 of their compatriots in the economics field that say that there isn't this kind of impact, right? And then force them to kind of defend their evidence a little bit more. You've got this information in your argument, so you ought to get some use out of it. And I think it's good that you present it, but later on in the debate, the evidence is not being exploited as well. It's typically more, well, what other evidence can I read? What other information can I present, instead of looking at how the arguments have developed? And by the way, that's the case with everybody in the debate. That's not just you. Everybody has this tendency to say, well, let me find the evidence and just plug in a piece of evidence here. And you need the evidence, and I'm so much happier with debates that have evidence than the ones where people are just making stuff up and hoping for the best. So I don't want to sound like I'm being too critical about that, because I do want you to use the information. And I thought everybody in here did a good job citing their evidence and using it pretty effectively. But you also have to make an argument from the evidence. The evidence doesn't make the argument by itself. You have to say something with that argument, and you have to contrast it to what the other side is talking about. And that's part of that refutation issue. So we're getting a lot of rebuttal arguments. Remember the difference between rebuttal and refutation. We get the rebuttal argument, well, I've got a counterclaim, but we're not getting a lot of refutation. Here's why your argument is problematic. Here's why my argument is better. And we need a little bit more of that. Your inflation argument was, I think, the weakest. I mean, you basically have this I don't even understand what the point is. You present the cost of living in 1956, what the wages would be, what the minimum wage represents, and that it peaked in 1968. And that would mean that we would earn $16 an hour now if we were still at that same rate. I'm going, and how does that prove that inflation doesn't occur because of increases in the minimum wage? It's got like no relationship to that at all on that particular point. So that I thought was a little bit problematic. Now, the benefits of increasing the minimum wage that you throw in at the bottom of your argument, that should all be stuff that Paulina has for the second negative, because her arguments are supposed to be, this is what we're going to get from the increase in the minimum wage, and they're taking that away. We're going to lose these things. That's the harmful consequence of doing that. So it felt a little bit like you're stepping on the significance argument that your partner is going to be making when you throw that in at the end. All right. Zara, I thought that you did a good job kind of reminding us what the main points were at the beginning. That's fine. And I think that there's an interesting argument that you start here that comes up again, but not until the very end of the presentation. And that is, look, the average person in the state of California is making like $55,000 a year. We've got 14 million people at this. This wage increase is going to affect people at the bottom, but the people in the middle are doing okay for the moment, and their policy, or the current policy, isn't going to change any of those folks. They're going to be in the situation. And when you come back later on and say there's something unfair about this, suddenly people who have worked to get to where they are, earn their wage, spend extra time going to college, for instance, got a professional degree in the healthcare field, for instance, that they are now going to get paid the same amount as somebody who's brand new in the field, or is working in a different field that doesn't have quite the same level of qualifications and responsibility to it, and we're going to put those people's wages up here. That is going to have an effect. It's going to have one of two effects. Either people are going to say, why am I bothering? And they just take the jobs at the lowest wages, the unskilled wages, or it's going to have the effect of, by the way, driving up wages in other places. Because let's face it, if you look at the person behind you and their wage is suddenly the same as yours, and you say, well, I've been here for 4 years and I've got all this experience, and now you're, the guy that you just hired, you're paying her the same amount of money as you're paying me, I need to be paid more. And that's your inflation argument. That's another part of the inflation argument. That's something that you could add to the argument. Not just that they have to compensate prices, but there's going to be other pushes on inflation that go along with this. And I think that there are good arguments to make on that. And you've got the start of that here, but that's not really where it goes. That's not really what you were advancing on that particular point. Here's the thing that I thought that you did the best here and got the least amount of use from later on in the debate. There are plenty of businesses that can afford the increase in the minimum wage, and you acknowledge that. Okay, Walmart and McDonald's, they'll be fine, they'll get by. But it's not the 66% that can afford it, it's the 34% who can't afford it who are going to be decimated by this. So McDonald's can afford to increase the wages of their workers to $15 an hour, assuming that it's the whole McDonald's company. Didn't we have somebody who argued the other day about how McDonald's are franchises and the individual owners are, they're trying to get by? Wasn't that in this class?
No.
No? Did we have a minimum wage debate before, or is this?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the second one. I heard it the other day. I just don't remember if it, I guess maybe it wasn't in this class. Maybe it was in one of my other classes where they were arguing about this. But there was a good argument that says this is a misnomer, for instance, that McDonald's is a big company because the franchisees pay them, but the franchisees are the ones who run the businesses, and they're the ones who are getting screwed by the increase in the wages here, because the McDonald's Corporation doesn't pay that. The franchisee owner pays that sort of thing. Yeah. I'm sorry if you don't like the way I say it. You can mock me, that's fine. This is a problem with sitting here, I'm going to get... He's always got a comment, that sort of thing. But forget McDonald's for a second. The people who run the hot dog stand in the mall, or the people who have the burger joint that's on the corner across the street over here, or the mom and pop pizza shop someplace. They're the ones who can't afford those increases in the wages. Okay, can Domino's increase their prices? Yeah, but can, Mama Petrillo's afford to do the same thing? I don't know that that's the case. And I thought that that's kind of the argument that you made here, that there's going to be some people who are going to benefit, and you've got this nice statistic. I don't know exactly how you got that statistic about the 82% versus the 18%. That needed to be explained a little bit more clearly, how you're meaning. But what it sounded like to me was that 18% of the people who get these wage increases are going to end up with a benefit because there's not going to be any consequence to them. They won't lose jobs and the company will be able to afford it. But 82% of the people who are affected by this are going to have a negative consequence in some way because the businesses can't afford to do that, or they're going to, for instance, go to the technological solutions as a way of addressing those particular issues. And I thought that's a really good argument if that's what that argument means. So later on in the debate, we never get a reference to this again. At the end of the debate, when you're summarizing, and they keep saying, oh, we've got all this information here about how it's not going to have an effect or any of those kinds of things, you can come back and say, well, we recognize it's not going to have effect on part of the population. They've estimated, a huge chunk. Oh, there'll be increased demand, and some wage earners are going to do better, and so on and so forth. That's right, some will, but 82% won't. So if we're comparing the benefits versus the costs, we think we've got the better argument here. And that's a good way, maybe, to apply that particular argument and get some utilization out of it. And this is another one of those things where I'm just saying, when you say something, saying it doesn't make it an argument. You have to do something with it. And that's kind of, like I said, people say a lot of things here in the debate. You need to maybe tell us what to do with those arguments a little bit more. All right, Paulina, a lot of your argument just sounded like we were going over the same territory again that we had. Why are you hiding? Don't be scared. Have I said anything mean to people?
No, but you don't get it.
Not even me.
From you might not seem like it, but from an outside perspective, it's like,
Also,
like
people
Jaws,
nowadays
like,
can't take constructive criticism.
Okay, well.
A lot of people are sensitive now.
Well,
The Shark's a good guy, so they can't take criticism.
It's not
I
sensitive.
haven't said anybody sucked. You didn't suck.
Yeah.
I've said very nice things about your evidence. That's good. What's that?
That's you implying.
I can't hear what you said.
She said you don't directly say it.
Oh, I imply that you
She
suck.
just
The way you're saying things implies that, which is okay.
Wait, see, you teach interpersonal communication.
Yeah, I just couldn't hear what she said. No, I know sometimes I get tone, but that's a different issue. That's a different issue.
My mom.
Yes, I am.
You and Ozzy together.
I'm very enthusiastic about what we're talking about. Okay. So, part of the problem is that, of course, that the benefits of increasing the minimum wage are supposed to be the disadvantages here because of the way you guys are doing this topic, because you're rescinding the increases here. So I do think that there is some stuff here that really reflects disadvantages, but the way it's presented is not really organized that way. So it just probably needs to be restructured a little bit. Again, I think the evidence that you present fits the kinds of arguments that you're supposed to be arguing, but you want to make it a negative consequence of withholding this wage. If we fail to increase the wage, here's what happens. We have more people who fall behind because they can't afford to live in the places that they have to work. If we fail to increase the minimum wage, we're not going to get the economic activity that occurs because of people having more money in their pocket. If we fail to increase the minimum wage, businesses are going to lose the advantages that come from increasing the minimum wage, the stability in the businesses and that sort of thing. Now you're saying all those things, but they're not as direct as they need to be. You need to draw a picture for people. here's the good stuff that's coming, and these people are pulling the rug out from under that good stuff. That's basically what the second negative has got to do, is kind of point out, here's the negative consequence of the action that they're talking about. Now, you also come up a couple of times and you said, well, it's a done deal. We're increasing the wage, so there's nothing we can do about it. Well, that's what this whole debate is about. And when you say that, I'm going, well, then why are we here? You know, if it's a done deal, they should just not be allowed to speak. The answer is it's not a done deal. None of these wage increases have gone into effect yet in California, and their argument is that we should stop it before it happens. So that just seems like okay, this one, maybe I do sound like I'm being a little bit mean. That argument is not appropriate. I don't want to say silly, but it's like, that's why we're having the debate in the first place.
Go home and cry now.
Yeah, don't do that. Go home and cry. All right, yes. In the arms of the angels, they'll take care of you, you know, that sort of thing. You'll find some comfort. All right. So, like I said, I think you've got good arguments. I think the evidence is there, but you want to phrase them like we talked about, build a disadvantage. Stopping the minimum wage increase will harm businesses by preventing these benefits that they're getting. Stopping the minimum wage increase will halt the economic development that is going to occur. This goes all the way back to writing your claims. What is the argument that you're making? You want clear statements, and you want declarative sentences, and that's the thing that I think is missing the most in your part of the argument, is that you need to make the declarative statement here. You're just presenting the evidence and kind of explaining what's going on, but it's an argument. You're making a cause-effect claim. Their plan will do this particular thing, and that's a bad thing to have happen. So I just think your arguments would be stronger if you did that. All right. Now, like I said, in the course of the debate, everybody's got some good information. It's not always being applied consistently. There are things that get missed on a regular basis. So, for example, that argument about technology and that sort of thing, I think you do mention it a couple of times. You extend it. I think that's a good argument. I think that's something that you didn't respond to, and that's a potential problem. One of the things that you should be doing is pointing out that this argument answers some of the things that they're talking about. How is it that these businesses are going to continue to thrive and be supported? Well, because they're going to find solutions that reduce their costs in the future, and instead of hiring the burger flippers or the people who are moving, you still have to hire somebody to do the cooking so far. Although we may end up having, a different kind of technology to do that. There'll be one person who loads all of the food into a machine that then cooks it and assembles it. By the time somebody has pushed a button someplace, we're not too far from, the Jetsons, and you push the button and the food just shows up, and Jane's whole day consisted of pushing buttons all day long. Do you know that reference?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure if everybody knew those kinds of references. And I think that's kind of the argument that you want to say, is that we're accelerating this, and we're not ready for that. The other big argument that I think you want to make is, every time they talk about minimum wage increases and how beneficial they're going to be, you want to say, are they talking about an increase of the minimum wage of 33%? Because that's basically what California is doing, having a 33%, or actually it's a 50% increase in the minimum wage, because if our current minimum wage is $10 an hour, going to $15 an hour, you are adding 50% more to the minimum wage. That's not the gradual thing that they're talking about, where, their study says, we haven't, when you have gradual increases in the minimum wage, you don't have this particular effect. Well, $1 a year is not a gradual increase. That's 10% a year for 5 years that they're basically doing. 10% a year is not the 3% that happened in 1968. It's not the whatever the increase was in 2009. So every time they've got this evidence, we didn't find this kind of effect, you should say, did it talk about an increase to the size that we're talking about here? And by the way, I think there was some pretty good data that talked about what the impact would be of if the feds increased to $10 an hour, that doesn't get discussed in this debate. I don't think I heard that data, and that's the one that mentions that there's going to be 600,000 jobs lost if we go to $10 an hour for the federal minimum wage. That's, of course, nationwide. They might dispute that to some degree, but the answer comes back, but we're not just talking about a $10, an increase to $10 an hour. California's going whole hog in for $15 an hour, and that's going to be the problem. How having, they've got this argument, which I think is the kind of a value argument that says people should be paid a living wage. They don't really develop it that much, but there's an argument that says, look, people they can't afford to live in places like San Francisco because the costs are so high. And they're making an argument that says, so that's why we need to pay people more. Your argument ought to be costs of living are not going to decrease in those places. And by the way, the costs of living, they exceed most of the prices that anybody would get paid if they were paid $15 an hour. The idea that you can get by minimum wage live in San Francisco, that's ridiculous. It's like the price of living in San Francisco is huge, or as Donald Trump would say, huge, that kind of thing. And even increasing your wage to $15 an hour is not going to alter that. It's just going to create more demand. The city is up there they've got limited housing. You do mention Los Angeles, for instance. I thought that was a pretty good idea. Doesn't make more houses available because you increase the wages of people. It just means that there are more people chasing the limited housing that's available with more dollars, which of course is going to increase the price of those housing. It's not going to make more housing appear. It's going to increase the price, which is your inflation argument again. So I think you can maybe take that argument and in essence say, this proves the inflation argument. Like I said, there's a lot of places where there's an opportunity to do a little bit of analysis, maybe some interpretation of the information, and people don't always just take advantage of that. They just try to rely on the information making the argument for them. And that's a drawback to some degree. I think people are getting better at it. I think the debates that we've been hearing have been getting better. What do you guys think?
I think so.
It seems to me like people are getting a little bit more sense of how these things are supposed to work, and so they're getting a little bit better. But there's still that tendency to rely on, let me just make the claim that I've got and hope that works instead of kind of putting it in context of the other arguments.
I think we took your input and then utilized it and then forgot about the other stuff.
Yeah, like I said, you're all doing stuff that I want you to do. That's, and first affirmative's organized. Hey, this first negative actually followed the first affirmative. The second affirmative's extending arguments. So, we're hearing those kinds of things. We've got second negative arguments that are basically disadvantages. There's just more to do. That's all there is to it. There's a lot more to do. So, I'm happy that people are making progress. We just want you to make more progress. That's all.
It was hard because we were on the affirmative and I'm actually against it.
Mm-hmm.
It was really difficult. That's all the difference.
Sometimes that's the case. I understand. If you think of it as a sport, all right. And if you're like the quarterback for a football team, and you play for your team, and you get traded to another team, well, you're still the quarterback. You're supposed to be able to do these particular things, and suddenly you're now playing against somebody else. Well, you still have to be good. You still have to do your job. And you say, well, I really want the Cardinals to succeed, but now I have to play against the Cardinals. I'm sorry, you're the quarterback for the team that's playing against the Cardinals. You got to want your team to win this week, and that's the way it goes. I think you kind of have to look at it that way. I know that people sometimes feel certain ways about issues, but as I've said frequently, I don't care what you think about the issue. I only care, can you find the arguments for your side and do the best you can. Sometimes it's easier because you care about the issue, but a lot of times it's just, I don't want to say it's a game completely, but it is, what is there to argue about? All right, and I think you guys found a lot of that. Okay, thank you very much.